Let's go to Hebrews 11. We've been going through this Hall of Fame of Faith list here, and we're now up to Jacob, and I'm going to do that one. We weren't planning on doing it tonight. We were planning on having VBS tonight, right?
Right.
No,
That was the original plan.
That was the original plan, but God's got a plan there too. And so we'll look at Jacob, and then Tommy's going to lead us through Joseph. But we're going to read verse 21. That's the one verse that talks about Jacob, and Tommy will lead us in studying Joseph next week, Lord willing. Hebrews 11:21, and I'll ask Tommy to read that for us.
It says, by faith Jacob, when he was dying, blessed both the sons of Joseph and worshipped, leaning upon the top of his staff. Okay,
so we've gone through most of the what we call patriarchs, right? The forefathers of our faith. People like Abel and Enoch and Noah and Abraham, Isaac, and Sarah, and now we get to Jacob, and literally the father of Israel. I mean, he's the one that God, if you remember, God changed his name from Jacob to Israel, the father of the 12 tribes of Israel, and that God would redeem out of slavery and bondage and death in Egypt and bring to the promised land eventually, bring them into Canaan. Each time we study one of these individuals, we've looked at their attributes and then also their actions, and then finally how we can attempt to make an application from their presence here in Hebrews 11. God puts them here. He chooses certain individuals, and we are going to add to that list just because there's other ones that I think we can learn a lesson from. But God draws our attention to them so that we can apply how they lived by faith to our own lives, what we can learn about their great faith can be applied to strengthen our own, how their attributes and their actions can help apply. We can apply that to help us follow in their faithful footsteps. So we'll look at Jacob's attributes and actions, and this is one that's been in every one because it's the faith chapter, and that's why they're here. But obviously, faith is one. By faith, that's how most of these start out, and so we know that's always an obvious included attribute that they had faith. We get a very specific application of that faith here, and it's honestly, if you were with us last Sunday night, it's really similar in verse 20 to what Isaac is recognized for. And so before we look at that one, I want to actually go back to Genesis and just look at a few. So I'm asking you to turn to Genesis 28. And while you're turning there, let's look at a few. We could probably spend weeks on looking at all the different ways that Jacob showed faith in his life, but we'll just pick out a few of them here tonight before we look at that specific application that was listed there in Hebrews 11:21. Last week we studied Isaac, and specifically what it said there in verse 20 of Hebrews 11 was his blessing at the end of his life of Jacob and Esau, and also Rebekah's and Jacob's deception of Isaac in that event. But I want to really focus on the positive attributes of Jacob. I mean, we know that was part of what happened in his life. We know that his name, honestly, it means conniver. And there was times in his life when he lived up to his name. But there's also so many times in his life when he showed very great dependence and faith in God. And so to me, that's an encouragement. I don't know about you all, but we might pick on Jacob for being a conniver, but there's been plenty of times in my life I've been a conniver as well. And so that doesn't necessarily rule you out of a life of living in faith. You can turn from that. God can turn a mess into a message, and that's what he did in Jacob's life. But Genesis 28, 1 through 5, we see Jacob's faithful obedience to God's command through Isaac. So I'll ask Tommy to read that, Genesis 28, 1 through 5.
It says, and Isaac called Jacob and blessed him and charged him and said unto him, thou shalt not take a wife of the daughters of Canaan. Arise, go to Padan Aram, to the house of Bethuel thy mother's father, and take thee a wife from thence of the daughters of Laban thy mother's brother. And God Almighty bless thee, and make thee fruitful, and multiply thee, that thou mayest be a multitude of people. And give thee the blessing of Abraham to thee, and to thy seed with thee, that thou mayest inherit the land wherein thou art a stranger, which God gave unto Abraham. And Isaac sent away Jacob, and he went to Padan Aram unto Laban, the son of Bethuel the Syrian, brother of Rebekah, Jacob and Esau's mother.
All right, so Dad's got some instructions here for his son, and it might look like just a narrative, a historical description of what's going on here, but it is Jacob. We see Jacob's faithful obedience to God's command through his father Isaac, not just a practical preference. Like, I don't want you marrying one of the local girls. I want you to. I know where our family, and they're far enough removed where it's not going to be an issue.
Right.
They're not that close a family, but I want you to take a wife from there. Not just a practical preference. And here's why. If you look at verses 3 to 4, you can see how Isaac ties Jacob's obedience to what the command here is. He ties it to the covenant promise of God. In verse 3, he says, "And God Almighty bless thee and make thee fruitful and multiply thee, that thou mayst be a multitude of people, and give thee the blessing of Abraham." He's now passing that Abrahamic covenant that Abraham received, that Isaac received through Abraham from God. Now it's passing on to Jacob. So this is so much more than just a practical preference. I mean, Jacob's obeying God's command here.
Right.
His faithful obedience, it's important. He could have chosen. He could have chosen not to follow his father's command. He could have said, well, that's a long way to go for a wife. There's a lot of pretty girls around here.
Right.
But he chose to obey.
Yeah. And I think, too, what we're seeing is, that faith is being passed on. I'm sure that all growing up that they had heard all about these things. And so, there's a knowledge of it at least there. And Jacob certainly wants a blessing, in his life for sure. So he's maybe got that initial obedience without having a choice just quite made yet. So
He follows in his father's faith by personally believing what his dad said this would be wise to do, and then actually acting on that belief, and that's where the rubber meets the road, really. Now let's read verses 10 to 22, and we see here Jacob's obedience in this matter, in verses 1 to 5, it results in some opportunities for him. So Genesis 28, 10 to 22.
It says, "And Jacob went out from Beersheba and went toward Haran, and he lighted upon a certain place and tarried there all night because the sun was set. And he took of the stones of that place and put them for his pillows and lay down in that place to sleep. And he dreamed, and behold, a ladder set up on the earth. And the top of it reached to heaven, and behold, the angels of God ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord God of Abraham thy father, and the God of Isaac. The land whereon thou liest, to thee will I give it, and to thy seed. And thy seed shall be as the dust of the earth, and thou shalt spread abroad to the west, and to the east, and to the north, and to the south. And in thee and in thy seed shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Behold, I am with thee, and will keep thee in all the places whither thou goest, and will bring thee again into this land, for I will not leave thee until I have done that which I have spoken to thee of. And Jacob awaked out of his sleep, and he said, Surely the Lord is in this place, and I knew it not. And he was afraid, and said, How dreadful is this place! This is none other but the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. And Jacob rose up early in the morning, and took the stone that he had put for his pillows, and set it up for a pillar, and poured oil upon the top of it. And he called the name of that place Bethel, but the name of the city was called Luz at the first.
There's a lot in this passage.
Yeah.
Sorry I interrupted you.
No,
There's
it's okay.
so much in this passage, and we'll look at those other three verses. But Jacob's obedience to the command that his father gave him, that God gave him through his father to get a wife there, notice that it results in a personal encounter with God. I don't want to get lost before we go up there, because when Jacob was being spoken to by Isaac, he's talking about God Almighty and the promise that God made to your grandpa. But now look at, especially beginning in verses 13 really is really where it's accentuated, but 13 to 15, God is saying, I'm going to be with you. That promise that was made to grandfather is now a reality in Jacob's life, but it wouldn't have been if Jacob hadn't obeyed Dad at the first. So let's read then 20 to 22.
And Jacob vowed a vow, saying, If God will be with me, and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and raiment to put on, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then shall the Lord be my God. And this stone which I have set for a pillar shall be God's house, and of all that thou shalt give me, I will surely give the tenth unto thee. So,
have you ever wanted wisdom or guidance from God, maybe about a specific, I don't know which way to go. I got two options here, God. I don't know. It might be in a relationship, might be in a career thing. if you ever have wanted to hear from God, there's a strong principle here. Jacob received this opportunity to get direction from God and to get a relationship with God, all because he obeyed
Right.
what Isaac had told him at the first. And this has to be a time of great encouragement for Jacob, this interaction with God here at Bethel. In verses 16 and 28, Jacob is now appropriating, he's taking for himself the faith of Isaac and Abraham. This is the first really strong indication we see where his father's God is now, it's his God. He's having what we so often use that language, a personal relationship with God. Jacob's having it here. I mean, he encounters God and interacts with him.
Yeah, it's where those promises that he has been told have now come, and he sees it for himself, and God has brought that understanding to him. He's had that personal encounter where it's all come together for him now.
And so God is now here at Bethel. He's extending that promise that he made to his father and grandfather. And what's the response of Jacob here to this encounter with God? What's the response of Jacob to his faith, his belief in what are now God's promises to him? To him. How would you describe what's going on in verses 18 to 22? Worship, yeah. I mean, that's what it is. And that's always the response of faith. It's a response of faith lived out in obedience, especially verse 18. It's so strong there. And Jacob rose up early in the morning, and he took the stone that he had put for his pillows. What's it now? It's a pillar. Or in a different version might say altar. I mean, he turned a pillow into a pillar because it meant something to him, and he wanted something tangible and recognizable to always remember, this is where I encountered God. Worship and testifying, this tangible altar that he would use to remember his account, and that he could point others to, his kids and his family. Like, this is where I began to believe. This is where I really had a personal relationship with God. And then you see even in verse 22, worship in the form of tithing. Jacob commits that he's going to obey God in faith by giving back to God a portion of what God's given him. And this is kind of where we get our concept of, tithing being a tenth. And honestly, that's the Old Testament. If that's what they gave, the government takes a lot more than a tenth. God, we could give God a lot more. I mean, that's just what's his from the start, is what Jacob's saying here.
Right.
If we go on to Genesis 29, we're not going to take time to read through all that, and I'm sure the account's familiar to you. But that's when Jacob goes to get Rachel, right? And I mean, he's just smitten with her. She's beautiful. He makes an arrangement with her father Laban. I'll serve you 7 years if I can marry her, and he does that. And you know the account. After they're married, does he have Rachel? Not first, right? Laban. The conniver got connived, and Leah is given to him, and then he works 7 more years for Rachel. Do you think that Jacob shows faith in even in that account there? I think, in a way, he knew that God had sovereignly arranged this meeting. I mean, he just shows up to a well, and there's Rachel, and he's like, that's the one. And, that God's picked for me, and it didn't go his way right away. But, he just trusted in God's sovereignty that, this beautiful lady that you arranged an encounter with, God, she's worth another 7 years, and I'll just patiently trust. I'll keep on waiting. And there's so much more in Genesis 30 and 31, Jacob's faith that God would fulfill the promise he made right here in chapter 28, of God's presence being with him and God protecting him and God prospering Jacob. We see that in chapters 30 and 31 in the interactions he had with Laban. There's more conniving going on and Laban toward Jacob. And even in Genesis 32, when Jacob and Esau finally come back together, a lot of faith in there that God would protect them. I know Jacob, he expressed in Genesis 32 how worried he was about what Esau's reaction would be.
Yeah, I think when we sit down and we read through these, we can read through the life of these people in 1 or 2 chapters, 3 or 4 or 5, whatever, depending upon who it is. But we remember that they went through this, and so whenever we are going through something, a situation, the faith that they're demonstrating here in just this day-to-day life and serving 7 years and then serving 7 more years and then seeing God prosper him through, all the different ways that he's living. I think that gives us encouragement to keep living too, and to keep on with our faith, in the sense that we go through stuff and the trials that we have, and remembering that God's not done writing the story yet, so to speak, and there is that faith that we can have in him. And when they were in the middle of their situation, they may have felt a lot of the same ways that we feel sometimes.
That's why we go back to Genesis, because we get like a short little synopsis there in Hebrews 11, but there's so many other aspects of how they showed faith in their lives that I hope we can apply to ours. If we find ourselves in a similar, it might not be identical situation.
Yeah.
And Genesis 32, when he's wanting to, he's worried about this interaction with Esau. That's when Jacob has that other vision. We already read the one about the angels and stuff, and the pillow becoming a pillar, and then he has this one where he wrestles with God. Yeah. And it's somewhat difficult to exactly understand all that's going on there and things, but he shows faith even in that, because he's like, I'm not letting you go until you bless me. Well, how does that show faith? So we recognize the source of our blessing. It's God. I will not let you go. You're the only one that can fix this. You're the only one that can bless me. But now let's turn to the feature of faith that Hebrews 11:21 was talking about. And God listed there, despite all of these other events in Jacob's life where he showed faith, maybe seemingly more exciting events to us. God chose in Hebrews 11 to say, by faith, and draw our attention to this aspect of Jacob's life. And it's in Genesis 48. Let's turn there. Genesis 48, 1 through 5. And it's kind of like Isaac's. God chose in Hebrews 11 to highlight Jacob's faith in his deathbed directive to his sons. Out of all the things that he a lot of failures, but also a lot of moments of great faith in his life, he chose this end point here. Like I said, they may seem more exciting. They may even seem to us, in our perspective, more evidential of a life of faith, a life of strong faith in God. But it's this aspect of faith, I think, that God's trying to tell us is really important. And we'll see why. Genesis 48, let's read verses 1 to 5.
And it came to pass after these things that one told Joseph, Behold, thy father is sick, and he took with him his 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. And one told Jacob and said, Behold, thy son Joseph cometh unto thee. And Israel strengthened himself and sat upon the bed. And Jacob said unto Joseph, God Almighty appeared unto me at Luz in the land of Canaan, and blessed me, and said unto me, Behold, I will make thee fruitful, and multiply thee, and I will make of thee a multitude of people, and will give this land to thy seed after thee for an everlasting possession. And now thy 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, which were born unto thee in the land of Egypt, before I came unto thee into Egypt, are mine. As Reuben and Simeon, they shall be mine.
All right, so what Hebrews 11:21 said is, by faith, Jacob showed faith in his leaning on his staff as he was dying here and blessing Joseph's 2 sons, giving them the firstborn blessing. And so why is that? Like, why did God pick that out of this whole life of great faith at times? Why did he pick that? Because, to me, if you were writing a movie, I don't know if that would be the climactic apex scene of, action.
Yeah.
But God says it is. And I think it's this. Anybody can have faith for a moment. But here's a life of faith, even all the way to the end. Jacob showing faith. There's a perseverance in faith. Do we believe all the way until the end? After all that went on in Jacob's life, was there trauma in Jacob's life? Try to think of why he's even in Egypt at this point. His son, the son he loved more than anything, thought he was dead. He had other sons who arranged all of that. So he had kids who weren't living for God. He thought he lost a son. He had the scare of maybe losing more when they went down there to get help for the famine. Then Benjamin was taken for a while. He's like, oh no, not Benjamin too. Right. And having to leave the land that God promised. This is Canaan. No, I'm going to stay put, God. This is where you put me. But now we have a famine. We have to go down here. And God, what's going on? A lot of trauma. Even after all the joy. He had just regained a son, the son he loved that he thought he had lost. He saw God provide in that time of famine. Yeah. Would Jacob keep believing? Would Jacob still have faith in all the ups and downs of life? And that's vital, because anybody can have faith for a little while. Anyone can have faith in times of joy, but will you believe for a lifetime?
Yeah.
And that's kind of the principle I think we see here. Will you keep believing? Will you believe in times of trauma? Will you believe when times are terrific? Will you believe God's promises to bring you back to a land that you left and that you think is just, wow, that's so far away, I don't know if I'll ever get back there? Can God be trusted when your life is turned upside down like Jacob's had been, and his promises like really seem impossible?
Yeah. There's something I was thinking about too just now is that, Job has that kind of faith too. And in fact, in the book of Job, he says, though you slay me, yet will I trust in you. So
The
even
worst
in the midst
possible
of all
thing
those
you could
things,
think of. Yeah.
just trust and faith in God alone.
And so Jacob's blessing of his firstborn here, and so well, is he the firstborn? Yes and no.
Yes and no.
He's the firstborn of Rachel, right? And so Jacob, and he doesn't do Joseph, he does Joseph's sons, which I even think that's remarkable. He highlighted that here in the passage you read. Your two sons which were born to you in the land of Egypt. I thought I lost my son. I didn't think definitely I had any grandsons. And then I come here, not only have I regained a son, but I see God's blessed you. You've got Ephraim, you've got Manasseh. God, your promises is happening.
Right.
Like you promised you'd make me a great nation. And my dad, he was one son that it was going to carry through. And then my dad and mom, they only had, or my grandfather, my dad and mom, they only had two sons, me and Esau at the time.
Right.
And so, but God, I'm seeing your promises unfold here. And look at verse 3. Because I think this is powerful. What is Jacob talking about in verse 3 of Genesis 48? And Jacob said to Joseph, God Almighty appeared to me at Luz. Well, we already read that passage. This is when the pillow got turned into a pillar, and that pillar is still there. Not like he's not pointing at the pillar, but he kind of is. He's telling all of his sons, this is when I encountered God, and this is why you can trust God.
Right.
Even though I might have wobbled and waffled in my faith, I'm seeing now, don't do that. Don't follow my example. Trust God. That's what he's doing here by looking back at verse 3, when the pillow became a pillar. Let's read now verses 20 to 21, same chapter, Genesis 48, 20 and 21.
And he blessed them that day, saying, And thee shall Israel bless, saying, God make thee as Ephraim and Manasseh. And he set Ephraim before Manasseh. And Israel said unto Joseph, Behold, I die, but God shall be with you, and bring you again into the land of your fathers.
All right, so he's telling his kids the promise of God. And what's the blessing? That God would bless them, just as he did him, and bring them to where? To the land of your fathers, the land God promised. God's promises can be relied on. That's what he's telling. Even in Egypt, yeah, they're still valid there. They're still valid there. Will they go back? I mean, there's a lot. Could Jacob have doubts about whether any of this would really come true? I mean, Joseph's doing pretty well for himself, isn't he? Why would you go back? I'm the second in charge of Egypt. I'm going to go back to Canaan where y'all were in a famine, and I think these things might have been through his mind. Genesis 49, look at 49:10, because Jacob now blesses some of his other sons. He's talking about Judah here in verse 10. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh, or until peace comes, and unto him shall the gathering of the people be. He's talking about kings that would reign in Judah. And ultimately one king that would come from Judah's descendants, and then be David, and then Jesus eventually. God gives him, I don't know if this is prophetic or what, but he's got faith. Judah, you're going to have kings that reign in the land that God gave us. If we look at verse 13, there's just a geographical note there. He's talking to his other son, Zebulun. Zebulun shall dwell at the haven of the sea, and he shall be for a haven of the ships, and his border shall be unto Zidon. Well, they're in Egypt, so it's not talking about the sea coast in Egypt. He's talking about Tyre and Sidon here. He's talking about modern-day Lebanon. You're going back.
Here in verse 10, looking for that Messiah at all times, and the whole promise is tied up in both the land and the Messiah.
And there's a firm faith. I mean, they're far from that land right now, and generations from that land right now, from owning it, themselves. And they're all little clues right here, what we just looked at. All little clues that Jacob did believe God would bring his descendants back to the land that God promised that he'd give them. But the strongest feature here is what I mentioned earlier, his deathbed directive. So let's go to chapter 49 and verses 30 to 33. And now it's time to read. Let's go 29 to 33.
All right, so 29 says, And he charged them and said unto them, I am to be gathered unto my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite, in the cave that is in the field of Machpelah, which is before Mamre, in the land of Canaan, which Abraham bought with the field of Ephron the Hittite for possession of a burying place. There they buried Abraham and Sarah his wife. There they buried Isaac and Rebekah his wife, and there I buried Leah. The purchase of the field and the cave that is therein was from the children of Heth. And when Jacob had made an end of commanding his sons, he gathered up his feet into the bed and yielded up the ghost, and was gathered unto his people.
All right, so this is a command, and it's not a if. Like, if y'all ever get back up there, bury me there. It's like, no, bury me there. Mm-hmm. If we read on to chapter 50, I got confused about this, and we'll go into this one. You go with Joseph, but Joseph does the same thing. He's like, take me back home, bury me at home. And in chapter 50, Joseph has the Egyptians embalm Jacob, and they actually go do it. Like, with Pharaoh grants them some leave, and they take Dad home to bury him, with his dad and with his grandfather and his grandmother and things like that. Mm-hmm. So this is no if. This is a strong faith that when he's given his sons this command, it's powerful right there. So what's our application from Jacob's attributes and actions? First of all, I think the prerequisite of a personal relationship. You can't write in a relationship with God on your parents or anyone else's coattails. Right. They can definitely lead you there, and you're blessed. I thank God for the blessing I had of growing up in a multi-generational Christian home, but there has to be a personal encounter with God. Yeah. Jacob was set up for that by Isaac and by Abraham. They commanded him to do what he commanded him to do, but Jacob had to obey his dad, and then when he did, on his way there, he had this encounter with God at Bethel. Yeah. And so
it had to become a personal faith for him, as you were saying. He had the knowledge, no doubt, from Isaac, and just knowing it and hearing things growing up and being reminded and passed on the knowledge, but it had to become a personal thing for him. It had to, just like for every one of us, we can have a knowledge of the Bible, but if we don't have that personal faith in Jesus Christ, it doesn't matter. Yeah,
and you have to appropriate it for yourself. Those facts have to become something you're actually putting your trust in, and not just a set of things you know. The product of faith, we saw that was obedience. God revealed and extended his covenant that he made to Abraham and to Isaac. He revealed it again and extended it to Jacob after Jacob obeyed. At the beginning and the end of the book of Romans, that's what we're studying in our Men's 7 Arrows Bible study. It starts in chapter 1, verse 5, and then in chapter 16, 26, the beginning and the end of Romans, a book that's all about us being saved by faith. Paul uses this little phrase at both the beginning and the end. He calls it the obedience of faith. Right. This is not, there's no dichotomy between faith and works. We talk about this all the time. A saving faith will result in obedience. It's an obedience of faith. And Jacob obeyed. And because of that, he got an encounter with God. He got to know God himself. And I think that's an important truth, because especially if we're looking for guidance, we started out tonight like that. Have you ever been wanting guidance or wisdom, direction from the Lord? Look, God's not going to guide you in the way ahead if you're not already going his way anyway. Does that make sense? I mean, we might say, God, I want to know your will. Well, are you already doing what he's told you so far? Right. And if not, well, then don't expect him to show you, what he's got for you ahead if you're not already doing what he's already asked you to do. And so, I think that's an important element really in that principle where we see Jacob obey.
And we are encountered every day with things, no matter what part of our life we're in. We're always encountered with things that God gives us, and which direction, what choice should we make? It's there. So we need to be walking in the light of what God has given us in obedience to him every day.
I guess I'm trying to put that out. I mean, he's not going to show you his additional will if you're not already following his revealed will. And he's revealed his will here. So if we're out of line with this, I don't think he's going to show you future things, what's ahead. The product of faith is worship. We talked about that. That's definitely application. One way that faith obeys is by worshiping like Jacob did at Bethel, by testifying and by tithing. He turned that pillow into a pillar. So this is my question for myself and y'all is, do you have pillars in your life? Because you need to. Do you have pillars? They're so essential. Jacob looked back. We just saw that here when he was blessing his kids. As he knows he doesn't have long, he's like, kids, look at this pillar. This is where I encountered God. And in that deathbed directive. And you know, God, they got to see that eventually.
Right.
But do you have pillars that you can look back to? Because you need them. You need them yourself. When your faith is tested, when you're like, God, I don't see how you're going to come through here, you need evidences of God's past grace in your life so that they can fuel your faith in His present and even future grace in your life. For when His promises seem really distant, or like, I don't know how it's going to happen. Do you have pillars that pillar can be used by you to point your kids back, or to others in your life to point them so that their faith can be fueled, or so that they can actually appropriate the faith you've shown them for themselves? They can have begin a relationship with God or continue in their own personal relationship with God. So let's talk about examples, and I want this to be practical. What are some pillars that we can point to, things in our life, or how can we turn pillows into pillars? Encounters with God into stuff we can point ourselves to and others to. Can you think of any ideas?
I went to school in Oak City, Scotland. I was about 10, 12 years old. I still like to go back there today.
Yeah.
That area means a lot to me. There's kind of a pillar there.
Well, and especially if you've seen God, you know, when God worked in your life there. I mean, it can be something as simple as like, I know what you're saying, like when I felt a close relationship with God.
I went back and got me a board from one of them buildings.
Yeah. I think that's definitely one. If you've got a hard copy Bible, which I hope you do.
They still call that farm the Jones Farm.
The Jones Farm. If you've got a hard copy Bible, and especially if you got like one of them study Bible types, like I know many of you have, do you know what's at the beginning and the end of that Bible? There's a lot of blank pages there, isn't there? Usually.
Yeah.
Man, right when God worked in your life. I mean, Krista's is full, and when she gets a new one, she usually cuts out the stuff from the old one and glues it into the new one because she doesn't want to lose how God's worked in her life, or something she heard at a message, or when she made a decision for the Lord. You know, it could have been a Sunday sermon, and she's like, no, I'm doing this, God. And so she's got it there. She's not forgotten it by Tuesday, you know, or 2 years from now, it's there. Or, you know, when we were going through a tough time financially, and then like you just see God come through, it's only a God thing. I mean, those are just little pillars. It's not really a pillar, but it's something you wrote. Now, it can be an icon. I think that's what they call them. Like if you go into some more liturgical type churches, they have pictures of of John the Apostles and other things like that. And I don't think it's wrong as long as they don't become idolatrous or worshipped. And so if you have something like this in your home, make sure it doesn't become your object of worship. But it should spur your worship to where it does belong. One that stands out to me is if you go by Dane and Charlotte's workplace, you know what's outside? It's a big old rock, right? And it's got things that mean something to them on. They had carved in there, you know, different Bible verses or terms, names in the Bible for when they saw God come through it. They drive in every day to work, and every day when they leave work, they see there's a pillar there, you know, it's something. And I didn't ask them for permission to share that example, but I can point AJ and Paul Allen and others that they're witnessing to. These are pillars in our life. Anybody else? But I know what Mike's saying. I mean, even a place can be a pillar. Whenever I go by Fort Benning, Mike, that's a pillar for me. You know why? I saw God come through a lot of times for me at Fort Benning. I just think about I don't like heights. I had to jump out of planes there at airborne school, and there's a lot of praying went on. There, and when I just see it, or even when I watch a movie and I was like, man, I remember I had never been closer to God, and when you're jumping out of an airplane. But these are all things. We need these. There's going to be times in our life we find ourselves in Egypt's. We will, like Jacob does here. Promise of God far away. Is He going to come through? And it's honestly, when we think that way, I think it's important. That's pretty silly, isn't it? Like when we have a promise of God and we know He's good, we know He's gracious, and we're like, are you going to come through? Like my situation is going to be the first time that God doesn't fulfill His promise. My situation is going to be the first time that God can't. He's incapable. No, of course not. I mean, it's silly that way. That's what these pillars do. They help strengthen our faith in times like that. Because that's what fear and doubt does. Fear and doubt makes us ask silly questions like that. Like, oh, I'm the exception to your promises, God. All the important things, we need them. Because that promise, and for Jacob, it was what he got there from God at Bethel when he was on the pillow, right? And he saw this. God said, I'm going to be with you, just like I was with Isaac and Abraham. I'm going to bless you, just like I was with your dad and your grandfather. But doubt comes in and makes us question that. And fear comes in, and it's louder than all things work together for good to them who love God and to them who are called according to His purpose. Doubt and fear can be so much louder. You know how you turn the volume down? You get a pillar. You go to that pillar, you look at God's past grace in your life, and like I said, they can also help us pass our faith on to others. And these others are watching. They are. Your kids, your family are watching. They want to see how you respond to Egypt. They want to see how you respond to negative news. Your son is gone. They want to see how you respond to famines. And they're listening. They'll even listen to deathbed directives. And Jacob says, take my bones home. That's what he's saying. And you know what that implies? That there's a home.
Yeah.
You know, when he says, it's time for me to be gathered to my people, do you know what that implies? That my people are there. And, you know, that God's promise is reliable. That's what all this implies. Even that's a pillar of faith that presents faith to them. So as we close tonight, that's my questions for you. I want you to really think about that. I mean, what obedience is God asking right now in your life? What obedience is required in your life for you to encounter God more deeply, just like Jacob did at Bethel? Until we obey, we ought not expect that we're going to get that encounter in that direction. And then when you get it, when God gives you that blessing, when God comes through, are you going to turn that pillow into a pillar for your faith and for those who are watching you at this time? So, any other thoughts?